It's one thing to be betrayed by a stranger, but when your own sister calls you a traitor in front of your entire family, it cuts deeper than any knife. I thought I'd never recover from the humiliation, until an Admiral walked in, looked her straight in the eye, and said 3 words that turned her face pale. The day my sister Emily started calling me a traitor wasn't one big dramatic explosion, it was a slow burn that had been building for years, like a storm you can see forming on the horizon, but can't stop. We grew up in a strict, but loving household, the kind where rules were rules, and you didn't question them. Our father was a Navy man through and through, the kind of man who wore his uniform with more pride than most people wear their wedding ring. Every story he told us as kids had some lesson hidden inside about honor, loyalty, and service. For him, the Navy wasn't just a job, it was an identity, a calling. From as early as I can remember, Dad would sit Emily and me down at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee in his hand and a faraway look in his eyes, telling us about his deployments, the places he'd been, the people he'd met. One day, he'd say, pointing at us with a half smile, "One of you, maybe both, is going to carry this tradition forward." And we'd nod, because in that moment, it felt like the most natural destiny in the world. Emily took those words to heart more than I did at first. She was always the one who stood a little straighter when Dad talked about service, the one who volunteered for school projects about the military, the one who made her bed with the kind of precision that would impress any drill sergeant. Me? I respected it, but I was quieter about it. I didn't wear my ambition on my sleeve. I just worked. When the time came to apply for officer training, it was a huge deal in our family. Dad insisted we both apply, said it would be a moment of pride for him no matter what happened. Emily was buzzing with excitement. I remember her staying up late, reading books on leadership, memorizing ranks, and even practicing how she'd answer interview questions. I was preparing too, but my approach was different. I kept my head down, studied, trained, and made sure I was ready for every single physical and mental test they'd throw at us. The day the results came out is burned into my memory. We were both in the kitchen when the email arrived. Emily's hands were shaking as she opened hers first. I saw her face fall, just slightly, but she masked it quickly, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well," she said, "looks like I didn't make it this time." She tried to laugh, but the sound was hollow. Then I opened mine. My heart pounded as I read the words, "Congratulations, you have been selected for officer training." I looked up, unsure how to even say it without sounding like I was rubbing it in. "I got in," I told her softly. Dad clapped me on the shoulder immediately, beaming with pride. "That's my boy," he said, his voice booming in the small kitchen. Emily nodded, still smiling faintly, but I could see it, the flicker of something in her eyes. Disappointment, maybe. Envy. Something sharp. From that day on, things changed between us. At first, it was small. She'd make little comments when I talked about my training, "Must be nice to get everything you want." Or, "Guess I wasn't cut out to be the golden child." I brushed it off, telling myself she was just hurt and needed time. I even tried to include her in my progress, telling her about my experiences, asking for her advice, but it always seemed to land wrong. Then one evening, a few months before I graduated from training, we were at a family barbecue. Emily was standing with a group of relatives, and as I walked over, I caught the tail end of her sentence. "Yeah, well, he basically took my spot. If it weren't for him, maybe I'd be in the Navy too." The words hit me like a gut punch. Took her spot. That's not how it worked. We weren't competing for one slot, there were dozens of positions available. The only thing that determined who got in was performance. Still, in her mind, I had stolen something from her, and that seed of resentment was starting to grow. Over the next year, that idea became her truth. She told the story to friends, to extended family, even to some of my old classmates. It wasn't always aggressive, sometimes it was disguised as a joke, sometimes as a funny family anecdote, but the message was always the same. I was the reason she didn't get her dream. I tried to confront her once, asking her why she kept saying it. Her response still stings when I think about it. "Because it's true," she said, looking me dead in the eye. "You knew how much I wanted this, and you couldn't even step aside for me." Some brother you are. That was the first time she called me a traitor. The word felt heavy, poisonous, like it didn't belong in our relationship. A traitor isn't just someone who hurts you, there's someone who betrays your trust, your loyalty. And hearing my own sister label me that way was something I never saw coming. It wasn't just the word, it was the way she said it, with such certainty, as if my entire character could be summed up in that single accusation. I walked away from that conversation feeling like a stranger in my own family. Dad didn't know the full extent of what she'd been saying, and I didn't want to drag him into it. I kept hoping that maybe, with time, she'd see things differently. But instead, it only got worse. By the time the night of my cousin's engagement party rolled around, Emily's resentment was no longer subtle. It was a sharp edge she carried openly, ready to cut me down whenever the chance arose. I didn't know it yet, but that night would be the moment her anger reached its peak, and the start of a chain of events that would change everything between us. The night of my cousin Mark's engagement party was supposed to be a celebration, but from the moment I stepped through the doors of the rented banquet hall, I could feel the tension like static in the air. The room was alive with the clink of glasses, bursts of laughter, and the hum of conversations, but underneath all that warmth, I had this nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, like something bad was about to happen. I'd been away on assignment for weeks, and this was my first time seeing most of my extended family since the start of my officer training. I came in wearing a simple navy blue suit, nothing flashy, but the moment a few relatives spotted me, they rushed over with congratulations, asking how training was going. I answered politely, keeping it short. I didn't want to dominate the conversation. This was Mark and Jenna's night, not mine. But still, every mention of the Navy felt like I was poking a hornet's nest. Because I knew Emily was somewhere in the room, sure enough, I saw her across the hall, standing in a small circle of people, a wine glass in her hand. She looked stunning, as always, her dark hair swept up elegantly, her makeup flawless, but her smile was the kind that never quite reached her eyes. She glanced my way, and for a split second, our eyes locked. It wasn't a warm look. It was calculated. Assessing. Then she turned away and said something to the group that made them chuckle. I told myself it was probably nothing. The first hour passed without incident. We made polite small talk, toasted the couple, and posed for photos. I even caught myself thinking maybe, just maybe, Emily had decided to let things go for one night. But then, during the lull between dinner and dancing, everything shifted. I was standing with two of our uncles near the buffet table, talking about sports, when I heard it, Emily's voice, sharp and unmistakable, cutting through the gentle murmur of the crowd. "Oh, you mean him," she said loudly, clearly referring to me. I turned just in time to see her motion toward me with her glass. "Why don't you tell them how you betrayed your own family?" The room didn't go silent instantly, it was more like a ripple in water. People turned their heads one by one, conversations fading as eyes started to land on me. My uncles looked from me to her, confused. My throat tightened, and for a moment, I didn't move. I felt frozen, like I'd been yanked out of my body and was now watching myself from the outside. Emily wasn't done. She stepped forward slightly, her voice carrying over the room. "You all think he's this big hero, but he's not. He's just the guy who made sure I never had my shot. You took it from me, didn't you?" There it was, the accusation, laid bare in front of everyone. My pulse was hammering in my ears. I could feel heat creeping up my neck. Every instinct in me screamed to defend myself, to shout back that she was wrong, that she was twisting the truth. But I didn't. Because deep down, I knew that in moments like this, logic never wins. Anger feeds off attention, and the last thing I wanted was to turn my cousin's engagement into a sibling shouting match. I forced myself to take a slow breath. "Emily," I said evenly, my voice low but steady, "this isn't the time." She laughed, but it wasn't a warm laugh, it was bitter, almost mocking. "Oh, right, because there's never a time to talk about the truth when you're around. Everything always has to be about you looking good, doesn't it?" A few people tried to break the tension. Mark's fiancée Jenna touched Emily's arm, telling her gently that tonight wasn't about us. but Emily shook her off, muttering something under her breath before turning away and walking back toward her table. The damage was already done, conversation slowly resumed, but I could feel the weight of the stares lingering on me, the subtle shift in the way people were looking now, not with open judgment, but with that cautious curiosity you get when you hear something scandalous. My appetite was gone. I stayed another hour, smiling where I had to, laughing when appropriate, but inside I felt like someone had dumped a bucket of ice water over my head. When I finally slipped out and got into my car, I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel. The word she'd used, betrayed, kept echoing in my head. It was such a heavy word. It didn't just mean I'd hurt her, it meant I had knowingly gone against her, against our family. And no matter how false I knew that was, part of me still felt the sting of guilt, because in her eyes, I really was the villain. On the drive home, I thought about calling her, trying to explain again, but I stopped myself. We'd had this conversation a dozen times, and it always ended the same way, with her shutting me down, accusing me, refusing to listen. I realized that no speech I gave would ever undo what she'd decided was the truth. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the scene over and over, but each time, I imagined a different reaction, me calling her out publicly, me walking out immediately, me telling the whole room the real story. But none of those imagined versions made me feel better. If anything, they left me with the same hollow ache in my chest. The next morning, I decided something important. I wouldn't fight her accusations anymore. I wouldn't try to change her mind or win some imaginary jury of relatives. I would focus on doing my job, on building my career, and on living in a way that spoke for itself. Because in the end, people can say whatever they want, but the truth eventually has a way of speaking louder than anything else. What I didn't know then was that my decision to stay silent, to simply keep showing up and doing my work, would lead to a moment I never could have planned, one that would flip our dynamic completely, and it would happen in front of someone with enough authority that even Emily couldn't brush it off. And when it came, it would only take 3 words to make her freeze. 2 weeks after the engagement party, life had mostly gone back to normal, or at least, as normal as it could, with Emily's words still echoing in the back of my mind. Work and training kept me busy, but there were quiet moments, late nights in my small apartment, mornings over coffee, when my mind would wander back to that night. I'd replay the way her eyes narrowed, the smirk on her lips, the way the room had shifted when she called me a traitor. I didn't let it consume me, but it lingered like a bruise you keep pressing just to see if it still hurts. Then, one Monday morning, my commanding officer, Lieutenant Harris, called me into his office. Harris was a man of few words, tall, lean, with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through you, so whenever he summoned someone, you paid attention. "We've been invited to a formal Navy ceremony next month," he said, sliding a printed invitation across his desk. "It's a big deal. Senior officers, decorated veterans, even an admiral or two. You've been selected to attend, and I expect you there in full dress uniform." I looked down at the thick cardstock, the gold embossed lettering, and felt a mix of pride and nervousness. These events were more than just fancy dinners, they were networking opportunities, moments where careers could quietly shift upward if you made the right impression. I nodded. "Of course, sir. I'll be there." When the day finally came, I spent the afternoon making sure every inch of my uniform was perfect. My jacket was pressed crisp, my shoes polished to a mirror shine, my medals aligned with precision. Looking at myself in the mirror, I felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. This uniform wasn't just fabric and metal, it was the result of years of discipline, training, and sacrifices that most people would never see. The ceremony was held at a grand naval hall, the kind of place where history seeped from the walls. Framed portraits of past commanders lined the corridors, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and old leather, and the hum of conversation echoed off the high ceilings. There was an energy in the room, a mixture of respect and anticipation. Like everyone knew they were standing in the presence of people who had lived stories most civilians could barely imagine. As I stepped inside, I scanned the crowd, and froze for half a second. Emily. She was there. Standing near the back, talking to a couple I vaguely recognized from our extended family. I had no idea she'd be at this event, but it didn't take long to figure out why. Our family friend, Captain Miller, was one of the guests of honor. And Emily must have come as his +1. For a moment, I considered walking right back out. But then Harris's words echoed in my head, sometimes the best answer is to just keep showing up. So I squared my shoulders and walked into the main room, reminding myself that tonight wasn't about her. The first half of the evening passed in a blur of handshakes, polite conversation, and speeches. I kept my interactions with Emily to a minimum, an obligatory nod when our eyes met, nothing more. She didn't approach me, but I could feel her presence like a shadow in the corner of my vision. Then the main event began. The lights dimmed slightly, and the announcer's voice rang out, introducing the keynote speaker, Admiral Jonathan Reeves. Even in a room full of decorated officers, Reeves stood out, not just because of the stars on his uniform, but because of the quiet authority he carried. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, but when he stepped up to the podium, every conversation stopped. He spoke about leadership, about integrity, about the quiet sacrifices made by service members and their families. His words carried weight because you could tell they came from experience, not just theory. I found myself leaning forward slightly, caught up in the cadence of his speech. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Then, instead of stepping down and heading straight for the exit like many speakers did, he began walking through the crowd, shaking hands, speaking with people one-on-one. He moved with a deliberate pace, as though every handshake mattered. I didn't expect him to come my way, but he did. One moment I was standing off to the side, sipping water, and the next, Admiral Reeves was directly in front of me. His eyes flicked to my name tag, then back to my face. He extended his hand, his grip firm and steady. "Lieutenant Carter," he said, his voice low but carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "We're proud of you." 3 simple words. But in that moment, they felt heavier than any medal I'd ever received. I was aware, painfully aware, that Emily was standing just a few feet away, talking to someone, but now suddenly quiet. I didn't turn to look at her, but I didn't have to. I could feel her attention locked on us, could almost hear the silence that had fallen over her. Reeves didn't know anything about the tension between us, but his words landed like a verdict. In a case I'd never been allowed to defend. "Thank you, sir," I said, meeting his gaze. I kept my tone steady, professional, but inside, I felt a mix of vindication and something softer, relief. The Admiral gave me a small nod, then moved on, continuing his slow circuit of the room. I let out a quiet breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Around me, the conversations picked back up, but I noticed Emily had stepped away from her group and was now standing alone, staring down at her glass. It wasn't triumph I felt in that moment, it was clarity. I realized that all the times I'd wanted to shout back, to prove myself to her, wouldn't have made a difference. She needed to hear it from someone whose word she couldn't dismiss, someone she respected, or at least couldn't argue with, and now, without any effort on my part, she had. For the rest of the evening, I kept my attention on the ceremony and the people around me, but it was impossible to ignore the change in the air between Emily and me. Before Admiral Reeves had spoken to me, she'd been moving around the room. With confidence, chatting, laughing, gesturing animatedly as if she belonged there. But after those 3 words, "We're proud of you," it was as if someone had dimmed her internal light. She stayed quieter, kept her head down more, and seemed almost restless, like she was itching to leave. I didn't approach her right away. In fact, I made a point not to. Not out of pettiness, but because I knew anything I said in that moment might come across as gloating, even if I didn't mean it that way. I wanted her to process what had happened without me adding fuel to the fire. Besides, the truth was, I wasn't entirely sure how I felt. Yes, there was a flicker of satisfaction in hearing the Admiral say those words in front of her. But there was also a deep, underlying sadness. This wasn't the way I'd ever wanted to win with my sister. After the speeches ended and the final applause faded, guests began mingling again. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne, and small groups formed in every corner of the hall. I was speaking with a fellow officer when I caught sight of Emily slipping out into the hallway, her posture stiff, her steps quick. Without thinking too much about it, I excused myself and followed. I found her leaning against the wall near the coat check, staring at the floor, her wine glass now empty. She didn't look up when I stopped a few feet away. "Emily," I said. Quietly she hesitated, then glanced at me. Her eyes were unreadable, somewhere between guarded and unsettled. What? I just wanted to check if you were okay, I said. A faint, humorless laugh escaped her. Why wouldn't I be? I held her gaze. Because I know that meant something to you. Hearing him say that. Her lips pressed into a thin line. For a long moment, she didn't reply, and I almost turned to leave, thinking she wasn't going to engage. But then she said, "You've been chasing that kind of praise your whole life, haven't you?" The comment stung, not because it was entirely untrue, but because of the way she said it, like it was something shameful. I'm not chasing praise, I said evenly. I'm doing my job. I'm working hard. And if someone like Admiral Reeves happens to notice, I'm not going to apologize for it. She looked away, chewing her bottom lip. You know, she said finally, when I didn't get in, it felt like a door slamming shut on my entire future. And then I had to watch you walk through that same door like it was made for you. Her voice cracked just slightly on that last part, and for the first time in a long while, I saw the raw wound under all the resentment. I didn't walk through that door to spite you, I said. I wanted us both to succeed. I never wanted this to be a competition. But somewhere along the way, you turned it into one. She didn't argue. She just kept her eyes fixed on the floor, as if she was weighing whether to admit something. Finally, she said, when the Admiral said that, it was the first time I thought maybe you deserved it. The words were so quiet I almost missed them. I didn't expect an apology, not a full one, not tonight, but hearing that was more than I thought I'd get. Emily, I said, softening my tone, I've never wanted to be your rival. You're my sister. That means more to me than any title or rank. Her eyes met mine then, and for a second, the walls between us thinned. I could see she was tired of carrying the bitterness, tired of seeing me as the enemy. But old habits die hard, and after a brief pause, she looked away again. I should get going, she said, straightening up. Yeah, I replied, stepping back. Take care of yourself. She gave a small nod and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. I watched her go, a strange mix of relief and sadness settling over me. The tension between us hadn't magically vanished, but something had shifted. The power of her accusations had cracked, and in that crack, there was space for something better, if we both wanted it. When I went back into the main hall, the atmosphere felt lighter. People were laughing again, raising glasses and toasts, swapping stories. Admiral Reeves was across the room, speaking with a small group of officers. I thought about going over to thank him, not for his praise, but for unintentionally giving me something I couldn't have gotten on my own, because in just 3 words, he had done what years of arguments and explanations hadn't. He had given Emily a truth she couldn't dismiss. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like maybe there was a path back to something resembling peace between us. That night, when I finally got home and hung up my uniform, I stood for a moment just looking at it. The fabric was still crisp, the metals still perfectly aligned. But it wasn't the appearance that mattered, it was what it represented. Not just service to my country, but the quiet resilience to keep moving forward, even when the people closest to you doubt you, and maybe, just maybe, it also represented the start of mending something I'd thought was broken beyond repair. The day of the final reckoning had arrived, and I could feel it in my bones like the heaviness in the air before a storm. Everything I had endured, every insult, every smirk, every whispered jab, had been leading up to this moment. My sister had no idea what was about to happen. She had strutted through life untouched, believing her cruelty had no consequences, and for years, I had let her think that. But I had been patient, quietly gathering every scrap of leverage, every detail of her hypocrisy, until my plan was airtight. That morning, she walked into the banquet hall with her usual smugness, the kind that dripped off her like cheap perfume, greeting our extended family and friends as if she were the star of some grand event. In her mind, today was about her triumph. A fundraiser she was hosting to flaunt her charitable heart and social status. Little did she know, it was about to become the stage for her complete undoing. I watched from the back as she basked in the attention, wearing her designer dress and her carefully curated smile, the same smile she had used to manipulate people for years. The speeches began, her friends praising her generosity, painting her as some kind of saint. I almost laughed at the absurdity, but I held it in, waiting for the perfect moment. When the microphone was finally passed to me, under the guise of giving a heartfelt speech in her honor, I walked to the stage with slow, deliberate steps, feeling every eye in the room on me. My hands didn't shake, my voice didn't falter. I started by thanking everyone for coming, then told a brief story about how family is built on trust and respect, how betrayal leaves scars deeper than anyone realizes. I saw her face stiffen just slightly, a flicker of unease breaking through her confident mask. Then I pulled out the file. A thick, heavy folder filled with documents, photographs, and screenshots. I laid it on the podium and opened it for the world to see. One by one, I revealed the truth, the embezzlement from the very charity she claimed to champion, the cruel messages mocking people she pretended to help, the recorded calls where she boasted about using others for personal gain. Gasps filled the room like gunshots, and I watched her composure crack into panic. She tried to speak, to interrupt, but I kept going, my words sharper than any blade. The silence of the crowd was suffocating, broken only by the sound of her friends and donors whispering in disbelief. Then, the final blow, the video. Projected on the massive screen behind me, it played her own voice admitting everything. In a drunken rant, laughing about how stupid people were to trust her. The room erupted. Chairs scraped back, people stood, some shouting at her, others just shaking their heads in disgust. She looked around, eyes wide, searching for an ally, but all she found were glares. Her empire of lies collapsed in real time. I stepped down from the stage, walking right past her without a word, and for the first time in my life, she had nothing to say. No insults, no excuses. Just silence. By the end of the night, her sponsors had withdrawn, her so-called friends had abandoned her, and whispers of legal consequences swirled in every corner of the room. Outside, the air felt cold and clean, like the weight of years had finally lifted off my shoulders. I didn't need to gloat, didn't need to see the aftermath play out, I already knew her fall would be long and merciless. As I walked away under the streetlights, I realized something important. Revenge wasn't about destroying someone else's life. It was about reclaiming your own. And in that moment, I felt freed. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to The Silent Revenge for more gripping tales.